Welcome, everybody. It's nice to see you all again. I'm John Webster. This is John Webster Film. I'm joined by my friend Jared Kozal, and we are going to be talking about Pride and Prejudice, the 2005 Joe Wright film. Before we get started, I just wanted to introduce Jared, and if you want to, say a few things about yourself, go ahead, Jared.
Hi there. Yes. So my name's Jared Kozal. I'm a medical student about to graduate, become a family medicine doctor, currently living in Connecticut. And I'm here because I connected with John over Twitter. Our shared love of Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, several other stories, including the one we're going to be talking about today, Pride and Prejudice. So this is my first time ever doing something like this. I'm a little nervous, but I'm also excited to kind of share our love for this story with y'all.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm trying to remember what came first. Did we bond over Game of Thrones, or was it this where we kind of realized that we were going to be buddies?
I believe it was Game of Thrones, just because back when the final season was airing, like that's, when there was a lot of engagement online.
Yeah.
So I think that we probably, as mutual season 8 defenders, just putting that out there, we probably bonded over that first and foremost, and then I quickly realized, your contributions to the Lord of the Rings, which is another story I love, and then not long after that, our mutual appreciation for one Keira Knightley led us to Pride and Prejudice, which is one of my all-time favorite films. So, happy coincidence.
Yeah, which, by the way, I think we both kind of made the joke for the stream that we're going to attempt to tame our appreciation for Keira Knightley, and we'll probably fail miserably. But yeah, I just want to say hi to a couple people on the stream. I see my good friend Stephen Stark is here, and we've got Lady Leaf, and a couple other people. Hopefully, we'll get some more joining us soon. But yeah, so we'll be talking about Pride and Prejudice. I guess we'll just start talking about how we came to the movie, because I think we both fell in love with the movie. We both read the novel, but that came afterwards. And I think, well, people have kind of heard my story because I've given it on a previous stream. Why don't we start with you? How did you fall in love with the movie?
So this was back, I was going to say, in about 2006, which is about a year after the movie came out. I did not see it in theaters. Pride and Prejudice is one of those novels that is often assigned as required reading for English courses. I did not get assigned that novel. I was assigned more Thomas Hardy, Far from the Madding Crowd, Tess of the D'Urbervilles type of books in my kind of freshman year lit. But my sister, one of my sisters, Jordan, she was assigned Pride and Prejudice. So she read the book. And then kind of as a treat after she finished it, my dad rented the movie from Blockbuster, which is a thing that used to exist. But then, and he brought it home so we could all watch it together. And I was kind of at the stage where, I was very much into sci-fi, fantasy, all that kind of stuff. And I had no inherent objections to a movie or a novel like Pride and Prejudice. That wasn't really what I gravitated towards. But I was happy to watch it. And honestly, and once we had gone through it, I found myself both really enjoying it. And by the end, I was sincerely thinking that was very, very, very good, to the point where we ended up watching it again before we returned the video. And my dad ended up buying the DVD. And over the course of several family movie nights, we ended up finding ourselves coming back to that one. And eventually I got my own copy and have just been watching it periodically ever since. And for the most part, my love for it only increases with time.
Yeah. My story goes to, well, first of all, full disclosure, I'm not going to say that I came to the movie on its own merits. I do recall an event of seeing the first Pirates of the Caribbean and seeing Keira Knightley and going, "Oh my God, who is that?" and then it just so happened that, like a very bad son, my mom's birthday came around in November of 2005, and I had forgotten to get her a birthday card. And so I thought, okay, what can I do to possibly make up for this? And obviously I knew that this was a movie she would probably really love. So I said, well, I'll take her to see Pride and Prejudice on her birthday. And, you know, acting like it was a completely selfless act, when in reality I was like, oh, Keira Knightley, I like her. Let me go see this. But still, it's not the type of movie that you, as a guy, you expect to go in and, you know, fall in love with. I just thought, you know, well, you know, I can go watch this, so I'll be interested to see it for Keira, and I can do something nice for my mom. But what happened as I was watching the movie was, I think it got about halfway through the movie, and I realized, like, what I was feeling as I was sitting there was like, oh my God, I really hope Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy get together. and part of me was like, what the hell is wrong with you? But it just made me realize, like, how immersed I was in the movie and how much I was falling in love with the characters. And it was really just, it just took me over. And a lot of it had to do with, obviously, with Keira Knightley, and I'll be going on and on about her performance in this movie, but she made me just completely fall head over heels in love with Elizabeth Bennett. And I think that helps me get on board with her character in the story, but also with Darcy, because then as an audience member, Darcy is like your stand-in almost. So over the course of the movie, falling in love with Elizabeth, you're right there with Darcy. And so what happened by the end is that I was filled with sort of this giddiness almost at the resolution of the story.
Yeah.
And so it's just been one of my favorite movies ever since then.
That's great, man. I can definitely relate to that feeling of not being sure if a story like this would be for you, and then the kind of unexpected joy of defining that no, it actually is, because it's one of the things I'm sure we're going to talk about. This story really, while it's a period piece, while it takes place in 18th, or in the case of 18th century England in the movie's case, it's really a timeless story, and it's based on universal human emotions that really anybody should be able to connect to if they're only open to it. And it sounds like you were.
Yeah. Stephen, the answer to your question is I've seen all of Keira's other films, so what do you think? But yeah, no, so I'm trying to think of where we want to start with it, because, you know, we could go through the film, but I do think there are a couple things bear mentioning. The cast in this film is just extraordinary, because beyond just Keira, you've got Matthew MacFadyen, who plays Darcy, and I think he's supremely underrated in this, because I know obviously a lot of Pride and Prejudice fans are going to talk about Colin Firth in the BBC version, and with good reason. He's phenomenal. But I think what Matthew does in this role is he brings a real vulnerability to Darcy, and it's part of why I think he is such a compelling character, especially in this film. because even from the get-go, I think you can see that he's sort of hopelessly in love with Elizabeth. And it's just, his stubbornness, it just gets in the way of, of sort of her seeing underneath, what he's like, and just, I made the joke online that I think the reason why I identify with Darcy as much as I do is because he's like the ultimate socially awkward person. Because he keeps to himself, and outwardly he seems kind of standoffish.
Yeah.
But then once someone sort of gets underneath, you see the depth of emotion that he has, and I think Matthew really does a great job with that.
Oh, I agree. I see Lady Leaf Underhill in the chat is asking about the 1995 version. I just want to say, we'll be focusing primarily on the movie today. I did rewatch the BBC version of this, which I do love as well. I do think it's a supremely excellent adaptation. I'll leave the merits of Colin Firth versus Matthew MacFadyen to others to discuss, but I think they're both wonderful. I have not seen the Olivier version from 1940, so that's going to fall by the wayside here. But if anyone does have any questions they want to bring up about that, I'll do my best.
Yeah, the 95 version has the great advantage of the fact that it is so long, and it has the opportunity to go into a lot of things that this film version doesn't. But we talked about this just before we started. There's just such an inherent joy in this film that I think Joe Wright, the director, really brings that to this adaptation. Yeah, and it's the actors' performances, it's the way the camera works, the cinematography is just gorgeous, and you have a lot of those tracking shots at the balls, and it's just, on a cinematic level, it's just a really fun movie to watch, and so I think that's what's kind of unique about this. And there's a lot of emotion and just yeah.
No, and I mean, for both of us, I think we can say, there's never anything quite like First Love. And you and I, this is the version we came to first. This is the reason we're here. This is why we love Pride and Prejudice, is because of this movie. I honestly, sincerely don't know if I ever would have read the book or watched the BBC version if it weren't for this one. So I am supremely grateful to it for that, in addition to just being what I think is a truly outstanding movie in its own right.
Yeah.
Full of such life and joy and universal themes that anyone can relate to.
So I was going to run down the cast, but it occurs to me we can probably tackle that going through the events of the film. Let's just kind of start at the opening, because it has such a beautiful opening, and there's actually similarities between the opening of this and Keira and Joe Wright's follow-up film Atonement, just in the sort of the title graphics and the way you hear like birds sort of chirping in the background, and we open up on just this beautiful sunrise.
Yes.
And we hear Dario Marianelli's just amazing musical score, and that's one of the things that I'll probably mention a few times, because his music is to die for. He is such a fantastic composer. He actually did win the Oscar for Atonement, and he's been nominated for all three of the Joe Wright, Keira Knightley collaborations. So,
yeah. No, and I'm going to butcher his name, but I do want to shout out. Dario Marianelli composed the score that musician playing the piano, John Yves Thibodeau, I believe his name is, does an extraordinary job as well, bringing that music to life. But the music really is a character in its own way in this movie. And you had mentioned like the opening with the birds singing. In a company, they're blackbirds, according to Joe Wright, which he kind of designated as Lizzie's bird for the film, and they recur throughout the movie at several important scenes. And so does this main opening refrain that we hear, a track titled Dawn, I believe. It's played several times, both diegetically in the movie by Elizabeth, by Mary, by Georgiana, and non-diegetically as well. So it really kind of becomes a recurring touchstone throughout the movie, and a very effective one, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it plays into such a key moment later on in the film, but we're going to get to that. See, I'm ready to jump all around, but yeah, and then so we have the sunset, and then the film opens up with Elizabeth reading a book, which I know Joe Wright likened to it's like she's reading the story that's about to unfold, and it is just such a beautiful moment as she's walking into the house, and then we get the famous opening of the book, which is in Mrs. Bennett talking to Mr. Bennett about the fact that Mr. Bingley has arrived in town and as a potential suitor for their daughters.
Yep. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a large fortune must be in want of a wife, or in Mrs. Bennett's case, husbands for her daughters. And I love this opening. It particularly the shot of the wide moor with Elizabeth walking across it, the kind of her kind of touching her lips as she's reading the book, hiding her smile, which is also something she does throughout the movie. And then when we get to the house, one of the things I'm really impressed by is just the way they take us through this entire living situation of the daughters very efficiently. This a long tracking shot, which there are several in the movie, taking her through Elizabeth walking past the door, to Jane being responsible, to Lydia and Kitty not being responsible, to Mary off in her own world, and then finally to Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, who we see through the window. That's another recurring thing we see throughout the movie, is characters looking through the windows as kind of a limited perspective of what we can see. And that contrasts quite beautifully with the live shot, the wide shots that we get later. But the thing I really want to emphasis on that is something that you already touched on, which is just the camera in this movie is almost constantly moving. It really does feel like it's trying to take us throughout every corner of this world. Period pieces can often be staged in grand, elegant rooms with just going back and forth between the characters with an occasional shot to admire the general splendor. This movie shows us everything. And it doesn't try to hide anything. Like, we see the kind of the messiness of the house and the kind of the intimate familiarity that everybody has with each other. And I think that kind of grounded me in this world immediately.
And I think it's worth mentioning that the film is actually set a few years prior to when the book is actually set, because I think they wanted to free it from the usual costume design that you see in adaptations of the novels. So you'll notice, like, later on when you have the character of Caroline Bingley, who would be more exposed to what the current trends are. She dresses closer to what you would expect in a Pride and Prejudice adaptation.
Yeah.
Whereas the costume design is, about a decade or so earlier.
Yeah. I believe they're called Empire style dresses with the high waistline. And yeah, I believe this movie, as opposed to the novel, which was published in 1813, this movie is set in 1797, which is actually on the cusp of in the midst of the French Revolution, I should say. And that's something I'm going to want to circle back to once we get to the ball scene. But in terms of just pure aesthetics and allowing the characters to have more comfortable, familiar dresses, I personally think it was the correct choice, both to distinguish it from the BBC series and just for the world that Joe Wright himself wanted to build.
Mm-hmm. And so this is a good time to mention, I want to go ahead and say, Stephen, no, Emma Stone is not in this. Okay, I know that's the only thing that would get you into this. However, there are a great number of cast members in this, as we were mentioning earlier, but names who, it's interesting, at the time they weren't big names, but they have become quite well known. You have the sisters played by Rosamund Pike, Carey Mulligan, Jena Malone, who was in the Hunger Games films, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, Tallulah Riley, who was actually in Westworld, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, the formerly married to Elon Musk, I believe. But yeah, this is actually the feature debut for Carey Mulligan, who would later go on to not only be nominated for an Oscar for An Education, but become a much bigger star. Jena Malone, you already mentioned. Love her in Hunger Games, also Into the Wild. She's great. And Rosamund Pike, we'll circle back to this more when we talk about Jane and just how sweet and benevolent she is. But I have to say, when I saw her in her Oscar-nominated performance for Gone Girl, almost a decade later, where she plays a very different character, her role here as Jane Bennett made that more effective because it really showed me just how incredibly versatile an actress she is.
Yeah. So basically we have this scene where they're all sort of crowding at the door listening to what's being discussed between Mr. Bennett and Miss Bennett. And this scene is great because once they're discovered, you get Donald Sutherland. He opens the door and it's almost as if he's pleased that they're all listening at the door, and he has such a warm performance throughout this film.
I love it.
And it's mentioned in the commentary, but what's great about his role is that he almost starts off the film in the periphery, and then as the film goes further and further on, he moves toward the center until you actually get that final scene, or one of the final scenes, which is between him and Elizabeth. And yeah, I think it's really easy to underappreciate his performance in this film just because it's Donald Sutherland and we expect great things from him, but he just has so many moments throughout it that are just absolutely wonderful. Later on in the film when Elizabeth is, looking to him for help when Mr. Collins proposes, and all this stuff where you see like they're a team.
Yes.
And but let's see. So basically, all of this is a way to get us into the first ball scene where it's, we get the news that Mr. Bingley has arrived in town. It's going to be a big deal. Mm-hmm. We get the ball scene, and which is just, it's just beautifully filmed. I think Joe Wright is a little hard on himself because in the commentary he mentions that he thinks it's not shot very well, but I actually think it's shot very well. Yeah. And so we do get to the moment where not only does Mr. Bingley arrive, he's accompanied by his sister Caroline, who is just,
I love her in this movie.
She's really kind of dreadful though, but
she is, but Kelly Riley is wonderful.
Yeah. And also accompanied by Mr. Darcy, who, no, Bernie, you have the wrong movie. It's not Colin Firth. Get over it. But, and it's a great moment because just before they've entered, Jane has said to Elizabeth, who is kind of making fun of all the guys at the ball, she says to her, one of these days, Elizabeth, someone will catch your eye and you'll have to watch your tongue. And this exact moment happens as Darcy enters the room and they're walking forward and he's just looking around and he does catch her eye, and it's just that love at first sight moment. And he's just like looks away real quick. This reminds me of like how I'd behave in a circumstance like that, where I would just be so standoffish to the whole thing and then be unexpectedly, caught off guard. But what's great is throughout this entire scene, we see the way he looks at her, and it's so obvious that he's immediately taken with her. But his outward, the way he presents himself, it's just like he doesn't come off as an appealing person at all.
Yeah. No, I mean, I see that the Colin Firth is coming up again in the discussion, and I will say that one of the things that I personally responded to about this version with Matthew MacFadyen is that kind of awkwardness that you mentioned. It's like a natural awkwardness that he doesn't. There's no artifice there. And Colin Firth, who is phenomenal, I feel like his performance definitely leans more into what I would call the period conventions, in that he comes across more as repressed, I would say. Not in any like meaningful, like emotional way, but as more of a, like, it's his manners that are constraining him rather than his heart, if you will. And again, that's not to compare the two performances in terms of quality. It's to kind of offer a point of differentiation as to why this version of Mr. Darcy, I feel, might be more suited to this particular adaptation, which is less formal.
By the way, I do need to take this opportunity to say that, yes, Bernie is just trolling us. Her and I have a sort of combative relationship with movies. So don't take it to heart. But, yeah, it's great. And then we have just the hilarious moment of when, everything seems to be going really well between Bingley and Jane. And so Elizabeth decides that she's going to ask Darcy if he'd like to dance. And so she says, "Do you dance, Mr. Darcy?" And he just like immediately shuts it down. He's like, "Not if I can help it." And just that sort of awkward moment with Elizabeth, the look on Elizabeth's face where she's like, "Okay," and she just walks away. And then you have the disastrous moment where she's basically hiding
under the bleachers, basically. It's like a teen romance movie.
Exactly. And her and her friend Charlotte overhear Darcy talking with Bingley, and he's just as insulting and insufferable as he can be, which, it's all a shield that he's putting up, but doesn't change the fact that Elizabeth overhears this. And so she thinks she has him figured out at that point, and it comes, and he says that Bingley says she's agreeable, and he says barely tolerable, I dare say, which is like, that's such an awful thing to say. But it comes back to bite him, because when they're all talking in a group, and he's trying to actually figure out ways to approach her, and they're talking about poetry, which she's not really about, and he says, "So what do you recommend to encourage affection?" And this is him trying to figure out how he is going to approach her, and she says, "Dancing, even if you find one's partner barely tolerable."
Oh God, yes. So you would mention, obviously we both knew Keira Knightley and loved Keira Knightley before we saw this movie. That moment that you mentioned when he asked, "So what do you recommend to encourage affection?" And she kind of smiles at him knowingly and says, "Dancing, even if one's partner is barely tolerable." And then she walks off. And that was the moment that I fell in love with Elizabeth, the character Elizabeth. Because I was like, I could just see what a total command she had of, her, of knowing herself, even if she doesn't know herself as well as she ultimately will. And just her easiness with a smile, her quick wit, like it was all there in that scene. And clearly it was born of pain because she was hurt when she heard what Mr. Darcy says, but rather than going to pieces, she puts up her fists, her metaphorical fists, and gives him a little jab right back, right where it hurts.
And you mentioned her smile, and okay, this is the part where I get a little gushy. Keira is radiant in this movie.
Okay.
Just it's her eyes, her smile. It's very easy to fall in love with Elizabeth, the character in this film, and I think it's key to why it works so well. And I mean, I'm not going to lie, this was the movie where I fell like head over heels for Keira Knightley, and it's the reason why I'm such a big fan. But just every little touch of her performance, you get moments like that where she's it's such a sick burn in that moment, and she just looks like she's deriving so much pleasure in that moment from doing that to him. But but then you get the look of just complete shock and almost horror on Matthew's face, where he's like, "Oh shit, I messed up really bad."
Yeah. One of the things which is an element in the novel and is meant also in the BBC series is that Darcy mentions the pleasure of that a pair of fine eyes can bring in the face of a beautiful woman, and that line doesn't overtly make it into this version of the story. I feel like moments like that, as brought out by Keira's performance, really do capture that spirit of that idea of why he falls for her and falls for her so quickly.
Mm-hmm. So coming up next, we basically cut to a scene which is between Elizabeth and Jane, and this is a scene that really establishes their relationship.
Yeah.
And the fact that Elizabeth is kind of teasing her because, well, first of all, she knows that there's a connection between her and Bingley, but she's kind of teasing her sister that she's, might be giving thought to the money angle when she knows that that's not really what Jane would be thinking of. But we learn that Elizabeth doesn't really expect to find or fall in love with anybody, because she's going to need to actually fall in love and not be swayed by any kind of good match, so to speak. And then of course, and she thinks she's not ever going to see Darcy again, which is hilarious, because at the start of a movie, I think there's nobody who's going to say, "Yeah, she's probably right." And so next, we have a morning after scene with the family at the breakfast table, and we really do see how they all function as a unit. This is one of those scenes that conveys a lot without needing any dialogue to convey it. You see how well they work together as family members. And basically, there's a message delivered that Jane is invited to dine with Caroline, Bingley's sister, but that he's going to be out, which is part of sort of her plotting to keep them apart, even at this early point. but Mrs. Bennett decides she's going to send her daughter on horseback.
Devious.
And, and it's about to come down pouring rain. So she gets sick, has to stay there. And so Elizabeth goes to, sort of look after her sister. And so we get now the situation where Elizabeth shows up, and then we have the group of Bingley, Caroline, Darcy, and Elizabeth. But when she arrives, there's just this wonderful, great moment where she arrives, according to Caroline, looking like a bit of a mess. But Darcy immediately, like, first he's frozen just looking at her, and he stands up real quick because that's the proper thing he's supposed to do. And you can see that he's just sort of entranced by her. And so we get this scene of all of them talking, where it's basically conversation, finding out about the different characters, and it's all the underneath the surface type things to this scene, where they're talking about things like what an accomplished woman is, so to speak, and you get great moments of like Bingley. This is a great moment of performance by Simon Woods, who we should mention, who plays Bingley, where he just does this sort of adorable, dorkish laugh at when Elizabeth, they're talking about what an accomplished woman is, and Elizabeth says, "I never heard of such a woman. She would certainly be a fearsome thing to behold."
Absolutely.
And
yeah.
What do you have to say about the scene?
So just to back up a little bit, when going back to the dinner scene, I mentioned that kind of easy intimacy that they all have. They're talking over one another. They're jostling one another. You can tell that they're a real family. And that with the scene with Jane and Elizabeth cuddling under the covers, obviously they're the two closest. And in this movie, they'll grow apart a little bit before coming back together. But I think that it's important to see them that way, just to see how close they are, and to see just how much Elizabeth is tied to her family, even if she and Jane are in some ways set apart from them, at least in terms of their propriety. But when it comes to the scene where she arrives at the manor, after walking 3 miles and her hem's 6 inches deep in mud, looking as Caroline says, positively medieval, which is one of those delicious line readings that I really enjoy from her. It's like, even though she walks in and she's got her hair down and she doesn't have any of the artifice of high society, she's striking. You can tell why Caroline is threatened by her, why Darcy is entranced by her. And even then, she, like, her manner of speaking, she doesn't feel uncomfortable or at least openly at unease in this situation. She's just here for her sister. And that kind of easy, like, concern is attractive, especially to someone like Darcy, who is surrounded by artifice, willfully or otherwise, when it comes to people like Caroline. And when we come to the scene that you mentioned about them sitting in the dining room or the parlor and talking about the whole accomplished woman, most of this dialogue is lifted directly from Jane Austen's novel, which, why wouldn't you? As Deborah Mogich, the screenwriter, says, if it's not broken, don't fix it. And they don't need to fix it. The dialogue here is perfect, but they do add a few embellishments here and there. Like, for example, that line you mentioned about, the "I never saw such a woman," that's from the original text, but she would certainly be a fearsome thing to behold. That's new. And Keira does it wonderfully. One of my favorite moments, or I have two favorite little moments here. One is when Mr. Darcy says, "And of course she must improve her mind by extensive reading." And then it smash cuts to Elizabeth, who immediately closes her book. I just always love that little moment. And then there's also when Elizabeth is, after she kind of gives her a little spiel about the fearsome woman, Bingley just lets out this laugh. It's such this. I don't mean this disparagingly. It's such a dumb laugh, but it endears you to him so much because you can tell that he is just like guileless. He's genuine in all the ways that his sister is not. So yeah, I just wanted to catch up on all that, but yeah, man, I love this scene.
Yeah. And then, of course, we get the next scene where it's really funny, where you have the other sisters as well as Mrs. Bennett show up, and you have the servant come in and say, Mrs. Bennett, Miss Bennett, Miss Bennett, and Miss Bennett, sir. And I have to shout this guy out because I did not obviously realize this at the time that I originally saw the film, but I have since watched The Crown, and this is an actor. His name is Pip Torrens, who plays, I don't remember the character's name in The Crown, but he's the one who deals with basically all the messy situations for the royal family, and he's so intimidating in that. And so watching him play this little part was rather hilarious this time around. But it's the way he delivers that is so great. And Caroline's exasperated at this.
Yeah.
And
for heaven's sake, are we to receive every Bennett in the country? I did want to mention one other thing about Caroline. I'm going to stop talking about Caroline soon enough because she's not in the movie for much longer. But the in that scene when they're walking around Mr. Darcy's table in each other's confidence, as it were, obviously the dialogue is great there. But one moment I really enjoy is when it's finished. There's this shot of Darcy sitting at the table, and Elizabeth and Caroline kind of leave the frame and then come back into it. And on one side, you've got Elizabeth dressed in white, and then on the other side, you have Caroline dressed in red, and they are kind of like perched on his shoulders for a brief second, the metaphorical angel and devil. But what's really interesting about it is then they cross paths and they switch positions, and then before going back to their seats. And I kind of thought it was, whether it was intentional or not, kind of elegant visual metaphor of, if one is the angel or one is the devil on his shoulder, but they're kind of he might be crossed up as to which is which, because at the moment he's trying to repress his feelings for Lizzie, and he knows Caroline, but ultimately comes to realize that Lizzie is the truth and Caroline is mostly false. So this is one of those things about like the camera doing so much work in those scenes that I really enjoy.
Yeah.
But then as of course we get to the excellent visual gag of receive every Bennett in the country, and then we get all the Mrs. Bennett and her other three daughters just kind of sitting down and proceeding to, in the most generous terms, make fools of themselves in various ways.
Yeah, and thank you, Bernie. His name is Tommy Lascelles in The Crown. Thank you for that. That was going to drive me crazy. Yeah, and they proceed to suggest that Mr. Bingley hold a ball.
Oh,
which is just like,
yeah, which is met. Yet another excellent Caroline line where Mary's like, "I believe that it's a perfectly irrational way to go about things. I think they would be better if conversation were the order of the day." And Caroline just looks at her with utter disgust and is like, "Yes, it would be more rational, but rather less like a ball." And then Elizabeth just has to step in and say, "It's like, thank you, Mary. Please shut up now."
And then the next scene is just, it's such a beautiful moment, because you get them all leaving Netherfield and getting into the cart to leave, and I think that this is a moment that can very easily go unmarked by like what a big thing it is by a lot of viewers, where Darcy takes Elizabeth's hand
Hmm.
as she's getting into the carriage and trying to help her in. But in those days, physical contact like that would be very rare. So
Yes.
then it's not like you go around shaking people's hands, especially men and women. So this is a moment of intimate contact between the two of them, the first one, and he's kind of shaken by it, and we can see the camera focuses on his hand and he kind of stretches it out, and yeah, it's just a beautiful, tender moment, and she's taken aback by it.
Yeah. No, on the commentary, Joe Wright made this kind of self-deprecating mark of like how he really doesn't like doing things like shooting people getting into and out of carriages. Well, he managed to make this particular one of the most intimate and important scenes in the entire movie. So maybe you're underestimating your abilities, sir.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can get that because I mean, I'm pretty much every single thing that I've ever, worked on, from, little school videos to, even, like little fun short films that I've done. You can, you're super hard on yourself. You're your own worst critic. So,
Yeah.
so I totally get that he thinks he's, butchered some of these things, but in fact, he just did an absolutely beautiful job.
I mean, this was his feature film debut.
Yeah.
So.
But and then I believe the very following this, I think
Collins.
we get the introduction to Mr. Collins, played by the great Tom Hollander.
Yes. So Mr. Collins, the very first time I watched this movie, I was, I shall generously say, repulsed, which is honestly the intention of the character, even though Tom Hollander plays it wonderfully. And I've gained a new appreciation for his performance because, especially after watching the BBC miniseries, where the actor who plays him in that, David Bamber, really just plays him as unctuous and odious in every possible way. Whereas Mr. Collins here is, he's more than anything, he's uncomfortable. He's uncomfortable in his own skin. It's another one. It's a side of that kind of awkwardness that we've touched on with Darcy, but here it's infinitely less charming because he dresses it up in self-flattery and, of course, his endless homages to Lady Catherine. So you're off put by him immediately, but I think that Tom Hollander is wonderful in the role.
Well, it's like, I mean, the door's open and you see the way he's dressed, the way he's standing, and he says, "Mr. Collins, at your service." You automatically know everything you need to know about him from that moment. And yeah, he's great. I do want to mention David Bamber from the BBC version because, that's no mark against him because he's a marvelous actor. It's just a difference in the way that the character is portrayed. And he's actually, speaking of David Bamber, he plays Cicero in Rome, which I've been discussing with Nessie. He's a wonderful actor and he does a great job. But yeah, and Tom Hollander just brings this sort of pathetic, sort of pathetic nervousness and
that's like boiled potatoes.
Yeah. Just that dinner scene that they all have is so uncomfortable.
Oh, it's fantastic because you had mentioned the rapport between Lizzie and Mr. Bennett there. Lizzie gets some of Mr. Bennett's lines from the novel here. It's like talking about his Collins's talent for flattery and being like, "Oh, believe me, no one would expect your manners to be rehearsed." Jane gives her a little kick under the table. Mr. Bennett looks like he's on his 5th glass of wine.
And he's holding it up and he's just smiling.
And there's an absolutely wonderful little moment at the end when Mr. Collins suggests that he reads to them all from Fordyce's sermons, and Mr. Bennett looks at him like, I would rather be pulled apart by hot pinchers.
And yeah, I have a hard time deciding whether he is like just completely oblivious to the fact that nobody wants to hear him read, or if there's this little part of him that's detecting that these people are not being receptive to him, and this is him trying to torture them just a little bit. I haven't decided which it is.
I think it's more the oblivious, and I do have to note that there is one person at that party who is receptive to hearing him read, and that would be Mary, because there's kind of an interesting little undercurrent where you get the sense from her looks and the way she's kind of positioning herself that if Mr. Collins were to ask her instead of Jane or Elizabeth, she might be receptive. But of course, he's far too oblivious to know this.
Yeah, it's funny because I had listened to the commentary before, but it had been a number of years. So listening to it last night, I picked up on some stuff for the first time. And when Joe Wright actually mentions that this is the case, it took me off guard because I don't think I had really picked up on it in the film. I took it more as Mary is the one who things aren't a joke to her, that she sort of is understanding of everybody. But it's interesting that it's pointed out that she actually does like him and would be receptive to that.
Yeah.
But yeah, but it is also funny how she's the one who she gets kind of how buffoonish her some of her other family members are, and so she's always taking things quite a bit seriously. But what's even funnier about this whole thing is that Mrs. Bennett, the one who is the most embarrassing, even she is like, what is with this guy? Because when she's having a private conversation with him and he's like, you are aware, Mrs. Bennett, that I have been given a parsonage of no mean size, which is a ludicrous thing to say. She looked at him like, I have become aware of it. like she gets how utterly buffoonish he is.
But she's still willing to marry him off to Lizzie. Very agreeable alternative.
And but it's funny. I crack up at this line. It's incumbent upon me to tell you that the eldest Mrs. Bennett is very soon to be engaged. It's like, first of all, there's no guarantee of that whatsoever. And second of all, very soon to be engaged really doesn't mean a damn thing.
No.
But so she pawns poor Elizabeth. Yeah, off on Collins, and I can't wait till we get to the proposal scene because that is just hilarity personified.
It absolutely is.
But
in contrast to Collins, right when Lizzie is, in her own words, about to despair of the entire sex, she runs right into one Mr. George Wickham. And that's the next scene.
Which, yeah, he's the most despicable person in the entire story. Although he doesn't come off that way at first. He seems like a very nice fellow. Elizabeth likes him a lot. And he is played by Rupert Friend, who is from Homeland.
Yep.
Which was funny seeing when he joined the cast of Homeland. I was like, wow, this is really different for him. And he's great in that. But he plays this person that's, especially in first viewing, you're receptive to him because he tells this story of the relationship between him and Darcy. And because Darcy has been so standoffish, I don't know if we necessarily completely believe him because we have the suspicion that there's stuff about Darcy that we don't quite and know about that he's probably not quite as bad as all that, but Wickham does come off as very friendly and open, and so we're at least receptive to why Elizabeth feels connected to him.
Yeah, absolutely. Wickham is one of those characters who I will acknowledge in this version of the story doesn't get quite as much to do. We don't see as much of his like easy charm and later some of his more bad habits. But I do think that he fulfills his role quite well because he does have that kind of presentation that contrasts him with Mr. Darcy in that he is more like he's more willing to kind of meet Elizabeth on her level, at least at the outset. And there's that scene where they're flirting in the ribbon shop, and she's kind of checking him out because she's intrigued. And of course, he kind of plays into that by that later scene when after they encounter Bingley and Darcy rides off, and then they're sitting under the tree. He kind of preys upon her sympathies in a way. Because she doesn't know the full story. This is somebody who he can kind of, win over to his side by expressing, how he feels he was wronged. And you ultimately discover that he's misrepresenting himself and misrepresenting Mr. Darcy. But in the moment, if it's somewhat like given Elizabeth's feelings about Mr. Darcy, it seems, if not altogether certain, but at least possible, that he could have just screwed Wickham over because, as Miss Wickham puts it, he was jealous.
Yeah. And so this basically sets us up for the next ball scene, which is at Netherfield. And again, before this, we get a great scene between Elizabeth and Jane, further establishing their relationship, where Elizabeth is kind of venting about the whole Wickham Darcy situation. And which is funny, it's like if you could just make things less complicated. Jane actually says, "I'll discover the truth from Mr. Bingley," and Elizabeth says, "If it's not true, let Darcy contradict it himself." She says without any intention of actually speaking to Darcy, so you can see how she's just being very stubborn, and at this point she just has complete distaste for him. But what's great about this is it launches into the next scene with another wonderful sort of radiant Keira Knightley performance moment where she says, Wickham is twice the man Darcy is, and Jane says, "Let us hope rather a more willing dancer," and she just lights up the screen smiling, and we go into the ball, and of course Wickham has not showed up, and because he's not doesn't want to face Darcy, and we get a couple of glorious dances, which the first is with Collins, who does not want to leave Elizabeth's side. And just, again, everything Tom Hollander does in this movie is utterly hilarious, because just the way he dances with her and the look on his face as he sort of sticks out his chin, it's just, and she is completely exasperated because all she wants to do is just get away from him.
Yeah, no, I mean, this entire ball starting from the scene you mentioned with Elizabeth and Jane, which is really kind of just out of a classic teenage romance, the two sisters talking to each other as they get ready, to transition into this kind of decadent ball scene with the tracking shots that take us through the general splendor, as Elizabeth says. And when because you can tell that Elizabeth actually is looking forward to this. She is like, she's dressed up, as the costume designer put it. This is one of the few times that she actually wears white in the movie. and gets her hair done up and everything. And then when Wickham's not there, even though we ultimately know from the story that Wickham is not worthy of her affections, it's a little heartbreaking for her. And right into that breach slides first Mr. Collins, who I love the way that he keeps trying to get his intentions known, and Elizabeth is barely paying attention to him because she's trying to listen to Jane, who's relating the story. And I just find it very effective the way they kind of intercut those two conversations as they're dancing. It must have been an incredibly difficult scene to pull off, but I thought they managed it technically very well.
Yeah, just wanted to put this up. That's interesting. I do wish that there were, speaking of documentaries, that there were some more. There was more documentary material for this film, because we have some bonus features on the Blu-ray, but nothing really in depth. But maybe one day for an anniversary edition. But
in the meantime, she leaves the dance floor and walks right into Mr. Darcy.
Yeah, but I do want to mention, and this also ties in with the dance she's about to have with Darcy, the exchanges between Elizabeth, Jane, and Collins, as they're doing the dancing, the choreography and the dialogue, the editing, the camera work, it's all beautiful because everything's so punctuated, and this is vital in coming up when she basically almost runs smack dab into Darcy, and he asks her for a dance, which is really noticeable because he's literally taking her advice at this moment, which he's trying to encourage her affection. So he's asking her to dance, which he, wouldn't do at the last ball. And she's taken back by this, and the line is, did I just agree to dance with Mr. Darcy? And Charlotte says,
say you will find him very amiable, and she says, it will be most inconvenient since I have sworn to loathe him for all eternity.
Yeah.
And then they both break down into laughter.
And what follows is it's both tense and extremely romantic, the dance scene. And what's great about this is that Joe Wright and the editor were originally going to make a very fancy cut from all of this, with cutting to their hands, cutting to different angles and all that stuff. And ultimately they just decided to do it with one take, which was a brilliant choice. Just being able to follow them, because it's like Elizabeth is just partaking in conversation just as a way of, sort of the social niceties of dancing. But then eventually they get to the subject of Mr. Wickham. Mm-hmm. And it's just these very, quick, abrupt exchanges. It's talked about in some interviews with Keira Knightley, as well as the audio commentary, that Joe Wright really likes this sort of fast clipped style of dialogue, because you're feeling this sort of awkwardness between the characters and this sort of restrained intensity between the two. And then eventually the dance, they switch it up where you see them dancing in a room full of people, but then it switches to them dancing basically alone in the hall, which is signifying that it's just the two of them in that moment. And just the camera work and just the way the music takes over, and it's just so utterly gorgeous.
This is one of my favorite scenes in the movie. I have many, but this is definitely one of them, for all the reasons you outlined, and especially because, I love that little moment where they are dancing. They're kind of going back and forth with their commentary about the ballrooms and what would you most like to hear? That reply will do for present. But then, and then once Wickham comes up and Darcy says that yes, he has lost his regard forever, and then they stop, and like everybody else around them keeps dancing, but the two of them actually stop dancing, and then they're just staring at each other, and they're, you know, like essentially, even though the rest of the room hasn't vanished yet, the rest of the room had already vanished for them. Their attentions are entirely focused on one another, not for the best at this moment, but you can just kind of see like the fierceness with which Elizabeth is determined to dislike him, and how, you know, while he still has his feelings for her, he's not going to let her walk all over him. So once they kind of resolve that beat, that's when it goes into the moment where it's just them dancing alone in the room. And for now, they may remain silent because at the moment, there's nothing else for them to say.
Yeah. It's just, and this is what I was talking about before with what this movie has, that as wonderful as the BBC version is, this is what made me fall in love with this film, which is just on a cinematic level. There's so much to enjoy. It's so beautiful. You get these sweeping camera shots, you know, following that, circling around them and following them, and the lush music, and just so much is said without them uttering a word. And it's just absolutely beautiful. And so then what we get is basically the camera following around basically the different Bennett sisters as
they make fools of themselves.
Yeah.
Because it's just like, it's a contrast to like the stately beauty of what we had just seen. We now kind of see the ugly side of it, where there's, first of all, there's Collins, and there's that wonderful little moment where he tries to go up and introduce himself to Darcy, and then Darcy like swings his elbow around and nearly hits him in the face, because that's how little regard he has for him. But it's led off by Caroline materializing on Lizzie's shoulder and hinting, what interesting relatives you have, Miss Elizabeth. And it might just come across as cutting in the moment, but then we end up seeing it where, you know, Mrs. Bennett is drunk and running her mouth about the marriage that hasn't taken place. She's spilling sherry. Poor Mary is singing quite poorly. Kitty and Lydia are flitting in and out of frame, getting drunk and dancing around. And then we cut to Charlotte and Elizabeth, and they're looking at Jane, and Bingley is looking at Jane, who's dancing, and this is when she's urging him to have Jane be more forward, because Bingley might not do so without proper encouragement. And she starts to say, she says, in the midst of her basically saying, "Oh, just get him in, marry her, they'll get to know each other after," she has a very important line which kind of tracks over the entire film, which is, "We are all fools in love." I really kind of think this is an efficient way to set up what's coming, the heartbreak that's coming, unfortunately. And one final line from Caroline, which may be her most vicious in the entire film, where she's dancing with Darcy, and she says, "I can't help but feeling that at any point this evening, someone's going to produce a piglet and make us chase it," which is vicious, but it kind of, since I didn't get to mention this earlier, it gets to this idea of, by setting it in this time period, during the French Revolution time period, the aristocracy was a bit under threat. So they were kind of operating from a place of fear, and Caroline is clearly feeling that fear. She resents having to associate with these people, whereas Bingley seems quite happy to be, in the colloquial term, slumming it. And Darcy is just Darcy has his own issues, but you really kind of feel like the contempt that unfortunately the Bennett sisters are engendering, which will cause problems for Jane and Elizabeth very shortly.
Yeah, I just want to stop here for a minute and just talk about a couple things since we're a little over halfway through. I just want to thank you guys again for being here. And, we've got some, wonderful people. It's nice to see you guys joining. I just saw Emma's name, and nice to see you here. I really do appreciate it. I hope you guys are finding some enjoyment from our little discussion. I'll talk briefly about what's coming up. And next week, I'll be resuming my talk of the HBO series Rome with Nessie. We'll be tackling season 2. And then the week after that, I wasn't keeping this quiet, but I think the cat got let out of the bag about a week ago, so I guess I might as well go ahead and mention it. The week after that, I will be talking Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet with Lauren, aka Shakespeare of Thrones. So I hope you guys enjoy that. I'm really looking forward to it. It's going to be a lot of fun. And I did want to mention on a technical side, each week in the description, I will be posting links to both the trailer for what we're currently discussing as well as what's coming up, just so if you guys haven't seen something, just so you can have a sort of a taste of what it is we're talking about, and then if it interests you, maybe you can go ahead and watch it. But yeah, I mean, that's about it. I guess we'll go ahead and jump back in. Let's go ahead and jump forward to the next morning, which is as the Bennets are all kind of, adjusting to the previous night. Mrs. Bennett has a hangover, and then Mr. Collins comes downstairs with the intention of proposing to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth just becomes incredibly horrified as soon as she realizes what's about to happen. Mrs. Bennett is super excited, and she's asking for everybody to leave the room. And Elizabeth is like, "No, please, Mr. Collins have nothing to say that anybody need not hear." Yeah. And she, with a look on her face, she's begging her father to stay in the room, but he feels at that point he's got pretty much no choice. And what follows is just hilarity personified, just with the exchange of glances between Collins and Elizabeth as he's giving this, wretched proposal.
This scene is so deliciously awkward in every way, and you just feel bad for everyone involved, mostly Elizabeth, but at the same time, just the way Collins is making a fool of himself, to the point that even as Lizzie is mortified and looking for any way out of it, there are moments where you could tell, like, even she is fighting back a laugh, because she's like, this situation would be horrifying if it weren't also funny, because she knows she's not going to say yes to him. So he's really just rushing headlong towards the cliff, completely oblivious, and it takes several denials on her part before she gets through his thick skull that, no, I'm not going to marry you. And then she rushes out and can't get out fast enough.
Before he even utters a word, he drops this little tiny flower right in front of her, and she just stares at it with like horror-stricken eyes,
like it's a venomous snake. Yep.
And as he's delivering his proposal, he's just standing there all nervous, and she, like, a couple times just sort of glances over like,
oh, I love that look.
And she tries to interrupt him several times. It's no, and then he gets down on his knees, and she immediately stands up, and she's like, "Mr. Collins, no, no." It's great. This is a wonderful scene for both actors, and he's just in complete denial. He just thinks that she's trying to make it difficult for him, and she has that line, "I am not the sort of female to torment a respectable man. Please understand me. I cannot accept you." And she says that you could not make me happy, and I'm convinced I'm the last woman in the world who could make you happy.
Yeah, and that's true, honestly, because Mr. Collins would run him over like a steamroller. So he dodged a bullet, even if at the moment he doesn't feel like he did.
And again, it's as soon as she rushes out, the doors open and we see the other sisters. Mrs. Bennett is furious. Kitty is, and Kitty and Lydia, they're giggling uncontrollably. Mary looks very sad because, again, she wants Mr. Collins to propose to her. And it's just
and Mrs. Bennett is distraught. "I shall never speak to you again, my child."
And we get this phenomenal scene with her, Elizabeth, and Mr. Bennett, who she has ordered to come along with her to talk Elizabeth into marrying Mr. Collins, but things do not go as she wants. And Mr. Bennett even trolls her a bit because he sets it up like he's going to be trying to talk Elizabeth into, when in actuality he's completely siding with his daughter. He says, "Elizabeth, from this day forward, you must be a stranger to one of your parents. Your mother will never speak to you again if you not marry Mr. Collins, and I will never speak to you again if you do."
Yeah, which it really underscores the bond that Mr. Bennett and Elizabeth have. To the extent that you can have a favorite child, it's pretty clear that Elizabeth is his, and there's no way he's gonna, like, as he ultimately says at the end of the movie, "I could not have parted with you to anyone less worthy." Mr. Collins isn't nearly good enough for Lizzie, and he is not going to, even if she were more open to it, he's not going to let her make that mistake. So I love that scene. I love where it's staged and shot. Actually, yeah, I was going to mention this, Lady Starfall, when we get to the Charlotte news a bit later, but there are hints throughout the ball scene where you kind of see Charlotte glancing at Mr. Collins when Lizzie is positively mortified by him. And it really does kind of subtly and nicely set up the fact that she sees an opportunity here. She is going to be pragmatic about this, although when we get to the actual scene, there's more to it, which is actually quite beautifully inserted. But clearly she's seeing marriage as an economic proposition. And as for Mr. Collins' part, whether it's just his humiliation or his Lady Catherine's influence, like, he isn't going to dwell on his failure with Elizabeth for long.
Yeah, it's very interesting watching her, because you're right, she does see an opportunity, and I think she knows full well that her friend is not going to marry this guy, but she sees that that's probably what Mr. Collins is intending. So I think she does guess where this is headed, and that's interesting that she's basically ready to pounce, so to speak. But
then Jane gets her letter. That's what's next.
Yeah, and so we discover that Mr. Bingley has left along with Darcy and with Caroline. And of course, our initial instinct is that Caroline is the one who has persuaded Bingley to leave, we'll find out that it's actually quite a bit more complicated than that to come. But in the meantime, we have Elizabeth, who Charlotte comes to her and says, "I've come to tell you the news. I'm engaged," and she's become engaged to Collins, which does happen very fast. Elizabeth is mortified. She's like, engaged to be married. It's like,
yeah. There's that brief scene before that where Lizzie urges Jane to go off to London, and then they have that lovely beat with Mr. Collins where he talks about, oh, a girl likes to be crossed in love now and then kind of teases her about Wickham and everything, which again underscores their bond. But when we get to this Charlotte scene, what I mentioned about that additional depth, so if you listen to the commentary, Joe Wright admits that Emma Thompson actually did some work on this script, although she opted to remain uncredited. And this scene with Charlotte is a scene where she wrote the dialogue. Mm-hmm. And I think you can kind of sense it because she gives Charlotte a bit more like humanity and sympathy in this instinct in this moment, where Lizzie quite aptly and correctly notes about Mr. Collins, but he's ridiculous. But then we actually have Charlotte have her scene where she basically lays out like that she's frightened, and this is a prospect that she's taking more as a sense of, desperation and obligation rather than for love, as Lizzie is so intent on doing. And it's a scene that I actually have grown to appreciate a lot more. Because Charlotte's a character you could very easily write off and say, oh, what a foolish choice she made. But she had her reasons. Everybody has their reasons.
And to her credit, she seems very happy as the story progresses, and her and Collins actually seem to have a nice, marriage, and they're both happy with their home. So in the end, she made a decision that she felt she could be happy making, and and it does seem to work out well within the confines of this story. Collins is a bit more antagonistic in the book, and a little bit more harmless, should we say, in this film. So we get to see that she brings out good things in him, and she's very happy to be able to, as she says, run her own home. We get to that scene via a moment where we see Elizabeth basically passing the seasons,
I love this.
With the moment where Joe Wright has her basically, on the, for lack of a better term, the swing, shall we say, and just spinning around, and we see time pass, so that we get the impression that Jane's been in London for a while. We get told that Mr. Wickham has, gone away, and so Elizabeth is invited to go see Charlotte and Mr. Collins to visit and stay at their home for a while.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I want to just kind of gush about this scene right here with Lizzie on the swing, kind of showing the passage of time. This is another one of my favorite scenes in the movie, even though there's no dialogue and it's quite short. Because as Joe Wright reveals in the commentary, this scene was not originally scripted. He came up with it during the shoot. The originally scripted scene involved Elizabeth, I think, watching the militia leave town, with including Mr. Wickham. But instead, we have this kind of just beautiful, like almost poetic scene where we see Lizzie, it's raining, it's muddy. There was a gorgeous quote in the production where Joe Wright talked about this scene where she has her feet in the mud and she's reaching for the stars. And you really kind of feel that, because she doesn't get the sense that everybody, like, she's a bit lost right now. She's reaching for something that she's not sure she can get. but she's not willing to settle for less, even if she is kind of in this unfortunate circumstance. And the way they kind of convey the passage of time with her swinging between the yard and the road out there, and I really kind of found it an elegant way to convey the fact that it's conveying the passage of time, but also the kind of the timelessness of it, where, you know, these ideas about, you know, falling in love and, you know, overcoming prejudices and all the themes the story explores, like they could be just as relevant today as they were back then. So theoretically, Lizzie could have kept swinging on that swing for 200 years and gotten off to exactly the same dilemma that she faces now. So I love this scene. I think it's very fortuitous that they decided to insert it as opposed to the original plan.
I just want to say hi to Sanri. Thank you so much for coming by. Great to see you. But yeah, it's great. And so we get to the scene where she goes to visit Charlotte and Mr. Collins, and he's and he's still salty about the whole thing because they're talking about you know, their home, and he says, yes, I flatter myself that any lady should, you know, be happy to be to have such a home. So that's kind of, you know,
keep spending time in the garden, Mr. Collins, just like your wife was.
And they're invited to go see Lady Catherine, played by, you know, the legend Miss Judi Dench, who is vicious in this. And so they go to see her, and again, great comedy from Tom Hollander. And they get there, and he curtsies with Elizabeth,
yep.
Mrs. Collins, and you know, Joe Wright actually mentions in the commentary he realizes he's curtsied about halfway through doing it and isn't really quite sure how to get out of it. Yeah. But and then we discover that Darcy is actually there as well with his friend Colonel Fitzwilliam. And this is just beautiful. We did a dinner scene between all of them, and it's basically just a match between Elizabeth and Lady Catherine, where she's trying to suss out, you know, this woman who I think she already suspects that there's a little something between Elizabeth and Darcy, and she's not only trying to find out stuff about her, but also try and make her look bad at times, and you can just immediately sense that this is a woman who is got her eye on her, basically.
Absolutely. I believe this was the first scene that they shot, so right from the jump they just put Keira up against Dame Judi and let them rip, and I would say that Keira more than holds her own, because she I mean, a lot of this dialogue comes directly from the novel, of course, but you can tell instantly that there is a spark of both intrigue and Lady Catherine is very clearly threatened by this woman who is many years her junior, theoretically shouldn't have all of her life experience, but Elizabeth just essentially, counters each and every one of her little jabs at her social status, everything from her sister's behavior to her age, and you can tell that Lady Catherine is coming to regard her as a formidable adversary. Like, oh, this is a woman I'm going to need to worry about if I want Darcy to marry my daughter.
Mm-hmm. Which is, we don't actually find out until later on, but this is an arranged marriage that, has been settled on since since they were children. So this is something that can very much be threatened if Darcy has developed an interest in Elizabeth. And so we get a scene where then, if she can't make a fool out of Elizabeth by conversation, she's going to do it by making her play on the piano. And Elizabeth, keeps saying how she's not good at it at all. But it's just an absolutely beautiful scene where Darcy kind of meanders over to the piano while she's playing, and they have a very tender moment. It starts off with her on the offensive, saying, you intend to frighten me by coming over here. And he says, I'm well enough acquainted with you to know that I can't frighten you even if I should wish it. And he lets his guard down. He does talk about how, again, it's that the social awkwardness, how he doesn't have the ability to converse easily with people he hasn't met before. And of course, it's another moment where she just lights up the screen, where she smiles at him, eyes wide open, and says, maybe you should take your aunt's advice and practice.
One of the best lines in the movie.
Yeah. And again, this is something that he's going to take her advice, because later in the movie, he's going to do this very thing where he tries to be more sociable and spend time with her with her aunt and uncle, and as a way to try and win her affections. But for the meantime, we cut to the scene in the church where
the worst sermon ever.
And this was a line cooked up by Tom Hollander on the day where he's reading, from the Bible, and he says, which are to be obtained only through intercourse, through the intercourse.
Audience perks up there. It was almost interesting for a second.
And then Elizabeth is having a conversation with Colonel Fitzwilliam about Darcy, and he's talking about how loyal he is, and actually he would make a very good husband to somebody. And as proof of that, he offers up that Darcy has recently come to the defense of one of his friends, and this is how we find out that Darcy is the one who convinced Bingley to leave and to not pursue the relationship with Jane anymore. And then again, I keep saying one of my favorite moments, but just when then Elizabeth is, distraught at this news, and she's staring at Darcy, and then his eyes dart up and she immediately looks away.
This is such a great little beat.
Yeah, and then the music kicks up. She's running out into the rain, and we get proposal scene number 2 of the film. And yes, this is like one of my favorite scenes in like any movie. I love it so dearly. It's oh my god! And you know what? I hate myself because I skipped over a scene that I have to mention, which is before the sermon, where Darcy actually comes over to the house.
Oh God, yeah.
Intending to propose, but he's so nervous he can't get the words out, and she's just like, she's sort of humored by this. She finds it curious, and she's like, should I call for some tea? And he's like, no. Yeah. and then Charlotte comes home, and he immediately rushes out. He's like, okay, now isn't the time. And then there's the line, what have you done to poor Mr. Darcy? I have no idea.
It's such a great little beat. Like, some might call it a little anachronistic, but I think it's wonderful.
I love it.
It's so well, especially because, like, earlier in this, like in the previous scene, Elizabeth was kind of sparring with them. But here, like, she shows him courtesy. She is just like, You want some tea? You want to come and sit down? And he can't even take that. He's just so overcome by her. And unfortunately, he probably would have been better suited to spill his guts there as opposed to in the proposal scene we're coming up, given what Elizabeth learns in the interim.
Yeah, so we turn back to the proposal scene, and again, just such an amazing scene. And again, it's this rapid fire dialogue where he's trying to get out this whole speech he's prepared. And then she's like, I don't understand. And then he just blurts out, I love you. Like he can't contain himself anymore. But, she's found out the news about Jane. So she is not receptive to this at all. And so she turns him down flat, and then he gets angry, and then she gets more angry. And it's basically, it's what Joe Wright describes as a car crash scene where you can't look away. It's the way the actors perform it. It's so magnetic. And it's one of those scenes that I think you hold your breath while watching and don't even realize that you're holding your breath.
This is essentially, in my opinion, 4 perfect minutes of cinema, really, because in Oscar terms, Keira Knightley was Oscar nominated for her performance. You would call this her Oscar scene, but I mean everything about it. First of all, the setting. I love the proposal scene in the 1995 BBC miniseries, but I'm sorry, setting it outside in a pouring rainstorm next to this great neoclassical architecture, like this is the kind of thing that this movie can do, and it does, just by scaling up the surroundings to match the heightened emotions of the characters and make it feel epic, because it is an epic love story. But really, like the way that these two go back and forth during this scene, like with this rapid fire dialogue, what really I find exceptionally, effective about it is there are pauses as well. Like they'll be spitting words back at each other so fast that you can barely follow it, and then one or the other will say something that you can see actually genuinely, hurts them or wounds them. There are like 3 such moments where she, like, for example, where she asked whether did you deny that you separated Jane and Bingley, and he's like, I do not deny it. And she pauses. And then there's the how could you do it? And then there's the moment where Darcy is saying, oh, I believe she was indifferent. And then Elizabeth spits back, my sister hardly shows her true feelings to me. And Darcy is stunned into silence. And then there's the final one where they get back and forth about the propriety of the way, and what's probably his most vicious line of the scene, Darcy's like, no, it was the lack of propriety showed by your mother, your 3 younger sisters, even on occasion your father. And you can tell that just really guts Elizabeth.
And you even have the thunder in the background to punctuate it. And because she did, what's heartbreaking about that line is that she'd be prepared for a comment like that to be made about her mother and her sisters, because I think she kind of respects that, but it's really that he says that about her father that really is hurtful, and because of the relationship that the two of them have. And yeah, and then they start talking about, and then she brings up Wickham just because she's mad already. And then that just makes him furious because, we don't know the full story yet, but that's where he's operating from, where
he's in the right on this one, and he knows it.
Yeah. And And then that final exchange. So this is your opinion of me. Thank you for explaining so fully. Perhaps these offenses might have been overlooked had not your pride been hurt in admitting the scruples of,
Scruples
of
about
our relationship. Um,
could you expect me to rejoice in the
inferiority of your circumstances? And she says, those are the words of a gentleman. From the first moment I met you, your arrogance, your deceit, your
selfish disdain
for the feelings of others made me realize that you were the last person in the world I could ever be prevailed upon to marry. And then dead silence and the tension. and he's
you can tell close. They want to kiss.
Exactly.
They're so close.
And then just the forgive me, madam, for taking up so much of your time. Yeah. It's just it's utterly breathtaking. And that scene, just the rhythm of the dialogue, the performances, just everything. And she gets no pleasure out of that exchange, because as soon as he walks away, she slumps back defeated, Yeah. And of course she goes back to the house, and then Darcy comes by to deliver his letter explaining, in his words, the offenses she has laid against him. And what's great is the way this scene is done. We get Darcy actually talking, visually speaking the letter, and then it translates to her reading the letter as he rides off. And so we find out the whole story about Wickham, which is that he is utterly despicable, that he basically seduced Darcy's sister when she was 15, and when he, and talking about how he refused the position he was offered by Darcy's father, and he was given the value of the living, which he spent within weeks, and when he wasn't going to get more money, he just deserted Georgiana Darcy. And then he says about Jane that whatever Elizabeth might think, that action was taken because he felt he was doing it in the service of a friend.
Yeah.
And
so this scene is another one of my favorites, because first of all, just the way it's shot and framed, starting with Lizzie in the darkness, eventually more light comes in, but then darkness returns. There are several shots of her where she is out of focus, and then ultimately after Darcy comes in and gives the letter, there's that close-up of her eyes. They come into focus and she turns around and he's gone. And she's finally seeing clearly, but he, right at the moment when she can't have him anymore. And there's that moment where she's looking in the mirror, cinematically, because she's looking at the camera, but she's actually looking in the mirror. And she's seeing herself as if for the first time. And while we've been all focused on the movie, this was one of the times when I actually did want to read a passage from the book, because it's one of my favorites, and it really kind of captures cinematically, I think, what Lizzie is feeling in that moment after she gets Darcy's letter. So this is from chapter 36, where after Lizzie learns the whole story about Darcy and Wickham, and incidentally, a moment that just gutted me when I saw the movie for the first time, not knowing the story, when Darcy, mentioning his sister, says she was 15 years old. Like that, I remember that distinctly. That just hit me in the gut for so many reasons. But regarding Lizzie's feelings in that moment, it says, quote, "How despicably I have acted," she cried. "I, who have prided myself on my discernment, I, who have valued myself on my abilities, who have often disdained the generous candor of my sister and gratified my vanity in useless or blamable distrust. How humiliating is this discovery?" Yet how just a humiliation. Had I been in love, I could not have been more wretchedly blind. But vanity, not love, has been my folly. Pleased with the preference of one and offended by the neglect of the other, on the very beginning of our acquaintance, I have courted prepossession and ignorance and driven away where either were concerned. Till this moment, I never knew myself. And while none of that dialogue is ultimately in the movie, I feel it in that shot where she's looking at the mirror, and ultimately cinematically how they end that scene where she's reading the letter, she's in tears. Charlotte comes in and asks if she's all right, and with kind of a choking hitch in her voice, she says, "I hardly know."
Yeah. And that's a great moment, which we don't actually see her face in that moment. The camera holds on her hand holding the letter, which Joe Wright describes as denying the audience that, close up that you might want to have. But yeah, I think it's a very powerful moment. Yeah, and thank you for having that on hand, because it has been a little while since I've read the book myself, but that's just completely beautiful.
Jane Austen's the best.
Yeah. And so at this point, Lizzie returns home, and Jane has also returned home. And she has not seen Bingley, during that whole time. And she asked Elizabeth if, there was any news while she was away. And Elizabeth makes the choice not to tell her about anything she's learned, which she will later regret not confiding in her sisters. But at this moment, she's, I think, in such a state of shock, and things have changed for her. She's uncertain about her sort of relationships with her family and the emotional state that she's in herself. Yeah. So I think she's just keeping things to herself at the moment. And so next, what we have is
Lydia gets invited by the Gardeners or not the Gardeners, the Forsters to go to Brighton. And when, unfortunately, they let her go. And this is a moment where I actually I love Mr. Bennett in this movie. Donald Sutherland's performance is wonderful. This is not his finest hour. And I kind of wanted to highlight a difference here, whereas Donald Sutherland portrays Mr. Bennett with such this warmth and depth of feeling that you've outlined that makes him just perfect for this role. That's a little bit of a change, because in both the book and in the BBC miniseries, he's described, he's still very much a caring father to Lizzie and others, but he's described frequently as indolent. And he pretty repeatedly demonstrates, I would call, dismissiveness to, in some cases, the point of cruelty of his three younger daughters. And in this case, this is one of the instances where it's retained, because the idea of sending his 15-year-old daughter off to this, with a stranger, essentially, to make sure she gets exposed in a public place, because she'll never be easy until she does, and we'll never have any peace until she goes. This is a moment where you really feel that, like, he's not blameless here. This is a mistake. Yeah. And Lizzie can sense it from the jump, and because we trust Lizzie, we trust her. So the sense of kind of dread is building here. But it's just a bit strange, because up to the point in the novel and the BBC series, we've seen just how callous Mr. Bennett can be towards his daughters and even his wife, dismissing them as silly girls, basically. And here we see him, make this choice that ultimately nearly ruins their family. And you just got to be So, I mean, Donald Sutherland plays the moment wonderfully, but this is a moment where I always wince because I know what's coming.
Yeah, I do want to mention really quick to Emma, there is a, because Leap mentioned that there are audio versions for free, but if by chance you do want to pay for a version, there is an Amazon Audible version, which is actually read by Rosamund Pike, who plays Jane in this film. So, and I've listened to a bit of it, and it's quite good. So I do recommend that one. But yeah, no, it's and you can see Elizabeth's exasperation because she's trying to talk him out of doing this because she sees how potentially disastrous this could be. But yeah, there is a side to Mr. Bennett who wants to kind of maintain peace in the house, and so he's kind of going along with this when he probably shouldn't, and it is going to have disastrous consequences. But Elizabeth herself is invited to go with the gardeners.
Penelope Wilton, Downton Abbey. I'm happy. I was happy to see, because I didn't know who she was when I first saw the movie. Now, in retrospect, I'm always like, "Oh, I like you."
Yeah, I'm gonna have enough on my plate without doing that because I am trying to balance doing this with also I'm doing the stuff with Here Be Dragons, and Helen and I are trying to orchestrate our next stream on her channel for talking about the Silmarillion. So yeah, if ever I have a spare moment, maybe we'll get to that, but now is not that moment. So she goes with the gardeners to the, where is it, to the
they're going to Derbyshire. They were supposed to go to the Lake Country. They can't. They end up wind up. Their carriage breaks down near Pemberley, basically.
Yeah, and so the gardeners get the idea to go to Pemberley, and Elizabeth obviously does not want to do this because the last thing she wants at this moment is another encounter with Darcy.
Yeah, and
they're convinced he's not going to be home, so they're like, "No, let's go ahead and do it."
Yeah. Before that, I think we would both be remiss if we didn't mention the absolutely gorgeous shot where first of Elizabeth in the carriage, the sunlight kind of dancing over her closed eyes, and then cut to the widest possible shot of her standing on the bluff overlooking the valley. Like that was, I mean, that might be the most cinematic moment in the entire movie, just in terms of, you know, as Mary says in the film, what are men compared to rocks and mountains? You feel it in that scene.
Yeah, it's, you just have to love moments like that, and then that again is what this version has in spades. It's just this cinematic grandeur, and you know, once again, Dario Marianelli's music just adds to it. It's a very sumptuous moment of cinema. And so they go to Pemberley, and a wonderfully comic moment as they roll up, and it shows, you know, Elizabeth stand up in frame, and she just starts giggling as she sets her eyes on Pemberley, realizing, you know, what she's actually turned down.
This is one of my favorite moments in the entire movie. It lasts 3 seconds, and it's just some of Keira's best acting in the entire film.
And so they go in, and this is a scene where they're getting to see all these, you know, sculptures and art that Mr. Darcy has collected. Oh, but before we talk about that, I do have to mention that, and I don't actually remember the name of the house. No, the house itself. But this is actually the house which Chatsworth, which has inspired Pemberley in and portrayed it in other versions. But interestingly, it was also the residence of the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire, so this house is also the setting in Keira Knightley's other film, The Duchess.
Yep.
I think in that film they use some other places for the interiors, but I do believe that they also use it for the exterior. So that's a fun little bit of connective tissue between the films. But so they go in and they see all of the art and sculptures and everything, and this is Elizabeth getting to see this side of Darcy, that he has an appreciation for such things, and she's learning more about him, and she eventually finds her way upstairs, and this is where we were talking about the music is actually used in the film as well, because she can hear it being played on a piano, and so it brings to mind Mary playing on the piano, and so she's curious. She goes in and she actually sees Darcy's sister Georgiana playing on the piano, and then we realize that Darcy is actually home as he surprises his sister and holds her up, at which point they both spot Elizabeth and she goes running out of the house.
Yeah, that's a couple of things about this. First, with I really like the choice of instead of it being a picture gallery, to use sculptures in that scene when Elizabeth is kind of starting to contemplate Darcy in a new light, like kind of being able to just see that whole 360-degree portrayal. It's a bit more sensual, but more dynamic. Again, with the camera movement there. The reprise of, as you mentioned, the musical refrain "Dawn" plus the Blackbirds. I believe they mentioned in some interview or the commentary that the idea here is when we first hear that in the very first scene, Elizabeth is walking home, and now here she's hearing it here at Pemberley, a place that even though she doesn't know it, she's coming home again, because this will be her home. This is going to be the place where she spends the rest of her life, essentially. And so it's kind of a nice, subtle visual cue that brings, or audio cue, I should say, that brings back the moments that from the beginning of the story. I think I don't know enough about costumes to say. I think that they might have been a bit more accurate to the new time rather than the novel's time, but I'll defer to your judgment on that one.
Yeah, because it's not. Do you have my volume or your volume up loud? Because occasionally I can hear myself.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's because I don't have headphones in. That could be it.
Anyway, because the film is set earlier than the novel, and so that's the explanation for the costumes.
But in terms of, go ahead.
Which is intentional. So that's all I was going to say. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, and then just you mentioned the bit with Georgiana. She has that kind of bit where Elizabeth sees her through the crack in the door, and there's a lovely shot as she kind of comes into frame before Darcy shows up, and I just love that moment where Georgiana leaps up and gives her brother a hug, because it kind of just shows her genuine delight, and his genuine delight. That's the first time in the movie you really see him smile unreservedly.
Yeah, that's him.
Yeah, and, for sure. And I also would have to be remiss if I didn't mention the actress, Tamsin Merchant, originally cast as Daenerys Targaryen in the Game of Thrones pilot we're never going to see.
Yeah, it's a shame that we don't get to see it, and because I would really like to see how she did, because I remember when she was cast, I was like, oh, I know her. She was in Pride and Prejudice. So it's unfortunate because she does well in this film, even though it's a small role, but I think she does a wonderful job. But so Darcy pursues Elizabeth outside, and just another, awkward, intense conversation where now Elizabeth knows everything, so she's sort of embarrassed to be seeing Darcy in that moment because she wasn't counting on him actually being there.
Yeah.
And it's just like you can tell at this point they're both, they both have such strong feelings for each other, but the weight of the previous encounter is just hanging over it. And I just love the way the dialogue is exchanged here, culminating with, he says, "Can I walk you back to the village?" And she says, "No," right away. And she's like, "I'm very fond of walking." And he says, "Yes, I know." And it's just so beautiful. And then she does another one of her absolutely radiant smiles and says, "Goodbye, Mr. Darcy." And she runs off. And then the camera focuses on Darcy's hand again, which, is a callback to the earlier scene. And it's just beautiful. But he beats her to the punch and returning to the and to the village and to the common room, and he's invited the gardeners and Elizabeth to come and dine with him and his sister.
Yeah.
And so this is him making a real effort to again follow her advice, and he's trying to win back her favor, however he can, and it's just beautiful.
Yeah. No, I really like the scene, especially the gardeners are just such affable people, and you can tell that they like him immediately. There's that wonderful moment when she gets back to the hotel and sees that he's there and just ducks behind the curtain, which always makes me laugh. But once we get back up to the manor and we start to see that they that Georgiana has heard so much about Elizabeth already. She feels like they're already friends, and Elizabeth, kind of teases her about oh, my brother had to put up with my unfortunate playing. And she's like, but he says you play so well, and she's like, then he has perjured himself most profoundly, which you can tell that they're flirting even though they can't acknowledge it. But Georgiana knows. She gives her brother that little look. She's like, I know what's going on here.
I do want to address this where Leaf says she runs off from Pemberley without telling her uncle. Well, I mean, she runs off the that area of the property, but I assume that she just goes back down to the horse and carriage and waits for her aunt and uncle, basically. So I don't think she just takes off, without her aunt and uncle. So, but yeah, and so they've all spent the day together, and it's gone quite well. But then Elizabeth gets in, a letter from Jane, and it's regarding Lydia, who we find out has run away with Mr. Wickham. And we have another wonderful Emma Thompson contribution where they're all sitting down waiting to see what the letter says, and Elizabeth comes into the room just in tears, busting out in tears, and then walking out of the room, which is great because it sets you up for it's really funny and comedic, so we're not prepared for the sort of gut punch of why she's crying, because it seems over the top in the moment, and then she comes back in the room and we find out why she's in tears, and it's just, again, it's a gut punch.
Yeah. No, I mean, this scene is just beautifully staged and directed. You had mentioned Emma Thompson's contribution. This is another, I think was a brilliant addition to point that here, and especially you can really kind of feel the agony that's building in both Elizabeth and Darcy at this moment, because Elizabeth is coming to terms with her feelings for him at this point, and she knows that with something like this, like even if he wants to marry her, it would be impossible. So there's that kind of beautiful double meaning to that line when they mention, like, he says, "Would that I could help you," and she says, "Sir, I fear it is too late." And what she means is, not only that it might be too late for Lydia, but it might be too late for her and for him. And of course, the underlying poetic beauty of it is that it's not too late, because he's going to make this grand gesture that will ultimately save everything.
Yeah, which, she doesn't know yet. So he says, "This is grave, I will leave you." And he takes off, and just the look on her face says it all. She, apart from that terror of what's happening with her sister, she, as far as she knows, that's, any chance, she had of, sort of mending fences with Darcy and the two of them potentially being together, that's gone now. And so she's chiefly concerned with her sister, and you can just see that as she's in the carriage, that beautiful shot of just tears streaming down her face. And she wonderfully conveys that sense of uncertainty. And but then we do find out, I'm trying to speed through some of this stuff because we are going over, but because there's some wonderful stuff with Mrs. Bennett as she's jumping to all these conclusions and just, you have sympathy for her, and also she's like, the way she goes about it is so grating. It's like, but
yeah, this is, you would mention we potentially speeding up. This is an area I think we can afford to speed up, just because the film itself also speeds up, and it's acknowledged both by the director and everyone that, in the book and in the BBC series, this whole section with Lydia being lost and everyone frantically searching for her, goes on for chapters and pages and several minutes of screen time. Here it's dealt with in, I believe, 4 minutes. I timed it. And honestly, I can see why some would consider that a criticism, but really I that as well. But ultimately, I think it's acceptable, because at this point, the story is Darcy and Elizabeth. And what matters from this whole business is that Darcy was the one who brought Lydia and Wickham together and kind of saved the day. And so we don't necessarily need all this agonizing over, like, oh, our prospects are ruined. I think that they effectively convey that in that one scene with Mrs. Bennett. And then ultimately the quick letter that we get where nobody would marry Lydia for less than $10,000 a year. And then finally Lydia slipping up and mentioning that Mr. Darcy was at the wedding and he arranged everything, which I think is an efficient way to condense, say, what happens in the novel of Elizabeth writing to Mrs. Gardner to find out the truth. Like, really, they need to get to the point here, because really what matters dramatically, even though those other scenes are always wonderful and I'm always happy to go back and read them, what matters is to get back to Darcy and Elizabeth. So unfortunately, we got to send Lydia and Wickham on their way.
Yeah, there is a beautiful touch that I noticed watching this time, which I don't think I picked up on before, when Elizabeth and Lydia are having the conversation about Darcy. Elizabeth tries to change wine glasses with her sister because she's drinking so much. And then when Lydia delivers the final line of, "Darcy's not quite so high and mighty as you," sometimes she switches them back. Which is just a nice little touch I really like, because that showed that their sisterly relationship as well. And it's not a good situation that Lydia's in at all. She thinks she's on top of the world, and she's really not. And we get that cruel final shot of as she's, ridiculously waving goodbye to her family, and then Wickham yanks her down, and that's not going to be a happy life for her. Yeah. But then we get to where we get news that Mr. Bingley is returning without his sister, and then we get him and Darcy actually walking up to the house, and we get the wonderfully funny moment of all of them panicking, trying to straighten up the room. Which is like, I love when we first open on them and they're all just sitting around, and Mrs. Bennett is just, saying they're all sprawled out on the couch, like humming to herself. And it's like,
yeah,
it's great. They're not prepared for visitors at all. And
no.
And then there's that panic where they're putting everything away, and miraculously the room looks presentable by the time Darcy and Bingley come in. And we get that hilarious moment where they all just sort of stand up like they've been prepared. And poor Bingley is just,
get a word in edgewise.
Yeah, he expects, he has a whole speech prepared, but then the second that Mrs. Bennett opens up her mouth, he doesn't have a shot, and she has that slightly frightening, hilarious line of when he's looking for an out and he's trying to escape, basically. And she says, "You did promise to have dinner with us the last time you were here. I've not forgotten." It's like something out of a horror movie.
It's frightening. What really strikes me about this scene is Lizzie's or Keira's performance, I should say, is Lizzie, from the moment when they realize Darcy's one of the people coming, and she like has that visceral reaction where she like jerks away from the window and is like pinned up against the wall, and then her entire performance throughout this scene, like the way her voice is softer, the way she keeps like surreptitiously glancing at Darcy, like. And especially like when he has that bit where he's like, "I'm returning to town tomorrow," and she just kind of almost whispers, "So soon." I love the way she handles this. Like you can really kind of feel the longing there, at least, especially on her part.
Yeah, and then there's that beautiful exchange between her and Jane after they've left, but soon to come back. And when Jane says, "I'm sorry, though, that he brought Mr. Darcy," and Elizabeth says, "Don't say that." And she's just, she's just so in love with him by this point. And yeah, her performance is just beautiful. I mean, throughout the film, but that is a really great line delivery by her. And then we get to the scene where Bingley and Darcy are sort of running through take two.
This is fantastic. Entirely improvised, I hear.
Yeah, and Darcy is just standing in for the role of Jane. And so while Bingley is sort of running around holding his hat, and he's like, "Oh, this is a disaster." And then he's like, "All right, so I'm going to walk in." And then Darcy's just standing there, and he's like, "Mr. Bingley." He's just standing there calmly playing the role for his friend. And then so Bingley goes back alone, and finally gets up the courage to ask to speak with Jane alone, and then proposes to her. And hats off to both him and Rosamund Pike for this scene. It's just absolutely beautiful and emotional, and and the way she says yes 1,000 times yes. And I mean, I do want to say that Simon Woods is just he is fantastic in this role, even though he's not obviously in the limelight, but he's really good. And speaking of, I was talking about Rome earlier, and he plays Octavian in the second half of season 2 of Rome. So I'm going to be talking about him again next week. But he's a very good actor, and I think he does a wonderful job in this.
Yeah, as you said at the very beginning, this entire movie just impeccably cast. But yeah, I love Rosamund's performance in this scene as well, because she doesn't get to emote a lot because Jane is by nature very reserved. But this is her moment to shine, and boy does she! She's just quite radiant there.
So there's happiness in the household. Everybody's celebrating and really happy, and then somebody arrives to rain on their parade in the form of Lady Catherine. But they hear that somebody's at the door, and one of the sisters, I don't remember who it is, says maybe he's changed his mind. just
I think it's Mary, but I'm not sure.
It's such a horrible thing to throw into Jane's face. It's like, really, come on.
Yeah.
But it's Lady Catherine, and she is there to talk with Elizabeth, and we're not about a rumor that is circulated, which we're not expressly told who's behind this in the film. It may be in the book, but I'm sure we strongly suggest that we strongly would think that it's Bingley's sister. Am I
possibly
correcting that?
I don't remember.
Is it said in the book? I don't remember.
I think it's more alluded to than confirmed, regardless of who it is.
But and this, a really fiery, great scene between Keira Knightley and Judi Dench. And I love Elizabeth's responses here, where she is evasive yet to the point, where she desperately wants to have been engaged to Darcy, as she's being accused of being, but she's very clearly not. But when Lady Catherine says, and will you promise never to enter into such an engagement? And she says, I certainly will not, and I never shall.
Yeah.
But it's the line right before that that's heartbreaking, when she says, are you engaged to him? And she says, I am not, she wants to be.
Absolutely.
And she basically kicks her out of the house.
Which is even as sad as Lizzie is right there, it is a real kind of hell yes moment for her, because she's like, I'm done with you. I don't care about our social standing disparity. Like, as she says, you have insulted me in every possible way and can now have nothing further to say. I must ask you to leave immediately. And then there's the wonderfully human moment where, Lizzie, her family has been listening at the door, and it's funny when they all kind of draw back when she opens it, but then they're trying to find out what happened, and then she quite rightly is just like, for once in your life, leave me alone. This isn't about you.
And then, before we move on to the big scene, I just have to mention it's a shot that I've always loved, which is when Elizabeth wakes up and she's just sitting at the table by the candlelight, and the shot pans over. First we see her through glass.
Yep.
And then just her sitting there, and it's just one of those shots that, I mean, Keira looks just absolutely gorgeous in that moment, and just the way she's kind of staring off, trying to figure out what she's going to do. And so then she goes out for a walk, and and she comes upon Darcy in his big movie moment.
Yeah.
Where it's go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I love the shot that you mentioned, the kind of out of focus to in focus, because this is now the moment when she truly does have clarity. I also love the shot right before that, where she's just lying in bed, staring at the camera, and then she has this little like gasp of air. I believe on the commentary, Joe Wright said it's like she forgot how to breathe. And in very shortly, she's going to have her breath taken away in another way.
Yeah, and so as I said, Matthew MacFadyen gets his big movie star moment here, where it's a shot of him appearing out of the mist, basically, and walking towards the camera with, the music behind him, and it's great because it's a shot that holds for quite a while. It just lets him walk towards the camera, and that's so great. I love when a movie is willing to take its time with a shot and just let the audience sort of feel that. And so he comes up to Elizabeth, and there isn't a moment of this scene that I'm just not completely in love with. It's so beautiful, and just he knows that his aunt has been to see her, and he wants to apologize for that. And then she talked about how what he's done for Lydia and for Jane, and then we have his second proposal. And he knows, surely you must know it was all for you. You're too generous to trifle with me. I believe you spoke with my aunt last night, and has taught me to hope, as I'd scarcely allowed myself before. Sorry, I'm just going to say off all these lines. If your feelings are still what they were last April, tell me so at once. My affections and wishes have not changed, but one word from you will silence me forever. If, however, your feelings have changed, I would have to tell you, you have bewitched me body and soul, and I love you, and never wish to be parted from you. And it's like, seriously, we're talking about a guy who, I'm sitting in the theater on one hand thinking, what the hell's wrong with me? Why am I feeling what I'm feeling? Then on the other hand, I'm like, oh my God, it's so romantic. And then she just walked up to him and, kisses his hand and says, your hands are cold. And the sun rises up behind them, echoing the very opening of the film. Yeah.
No, everything about this scene, like whether it's the initial proposal, Darcy's initial proposal, or this scene, I go back and forth as to which is my favorite. They're 1 and 1A basically. Joe Wright, I believe, with the long walk up of Matthew as Mr. Darcy, he said this might be a bit over the top, but if we haven't earned it at this point, I don't know what. And I was like, oh, you've earned it. Trust me, you've earned it. The dialogue, which is a wonderful blend of coming directly from Jane Austen, and then a few additions that have become almost as iconic, specifically the "You have bewitched me, body and soul," and I love you. And then just the Keira's expressions throughout that entire scene, and ultimately the final shot where she takes his hand, she kisses it. They put their heads together, and the sun comes up between them as kind of, bringing the movie full circle, sunrise to sunrise, only now they're really in a different place. Honestly, there have been a lot of movies. There have been a lot of, incredible romantic stories. If you asked me to take one shot from one movie and say, this defines romance, that would be the one I would pick. It's just everything about it, speaks to me and speaks to my heart, and I love it as sincerely.
Yeah, I'm sure I've used a GIF of that shot like a million times in my Twitter posts. So, and of course, as glorious as that scene is, I'm going to just gush about this final scene, second to final. But in some versions, it is the final.
Yeah.
But but honestly, you could say final because I'll just connect these two final scenes together into one, where Darcy is asking permission from Elizabeth's father. She's waiting outside the door, just pacing back and forth. And what's great about this whole scene is you just feel the excitement of this, love and, and just, they're almost at the end. Just let things work out. And Darcy opens the door, he comes out, and they pass each other by real quick. She goes in, and then her father says, "Please close the door, Elizabeth," and she just slowly closes it because their eyes are locked. They can't not look at each other at this point. And the scene between her and Mr. Bennett is just absolutely wonderful. I have gone on about this scene many times to people when I talk about this movie, because there's just this moment when she's talking about the extent of her feelings for Darcy, where she's saying, he and I are both so similar, we're both so stubborn, and then she just kind of breaks down in giddy laughter. And I just remember it made me feel so deliriously happy in the theater. It's the movie that I always say that makes you want to be in love, and just this final and this exchange between her and her father just really drives that home. Again, it's because as a viewer, I've fallen in love with Elizabeth. I have great affection for Darcy because he's, if you as the audience member has fallen in love with Elizabeth, Darcy is a proxy for you, the audience member. So you're happy for both of them. And it's such a great moment.
Yeah, it's a wonderful scene. Donald Sutherland is amazing in it. The way that he and Keira mirror each other's performances with these little gestures, and when she tears up, he tears up. When she covers her lips with her hand to hide her smile, he does the same. And you just really kind of get the sense of just, again, how deep their bond goes. And the fact that when he is asking her, "Oh, are you out of your senses?" in the beginning of the scene, it's not because he's not happy for it, it's because he wants nothing but the best for her. And he didn't understand just how much she loved him and what he had done for her. And when he learns it, he's absolutely overcome. And that's when he's like, "I must pay him back." And she's like, "No, you mustn't." He wouldn't want it, because for him, he did it all for her. And that information doesn't need to spread further than that room. I do, just jumping outside briefly, I do love that where they intercut the scene with Mr. Darcy walking back and forth, pacing back and forth in the yard, and you see Jane and Mrs. Bennett through the window, kind of a cloudy window, showing they're not really having a full perspective on it yet, but they will. And they're like, "I thought you didn't like him. We must have been wrong." And we're like, "Yeah, you should watch the rest of the movie. Then you'll understand what happened." But yeah, going back to that final moment where he gives his consent and she is just overcome with joy, and she gives him a kiss on her head and then runs out, and he's just sitting there, kind of smiles. Throws out the line about marrying Kitty, but
Yeah, if any young men come for Mary or Kitty, for heaven's sake, send them in. I'm quite at my leisure.
Yeah.
And it is a great moment, and we should mention at this point that in the UK, this is actually how the film ends. Because apparently some UK audiences found the American ending too sugary, shall we say? But we're Americans. We love our, beautiful, wonderful happy endings. And you know what? I would not give up the final scene for anything in the world.
Absolutely.
So we cut to Elizabeth and Darcy, seemingly after they've been wed at Pemberley, and they're talking about their, Darcy is, trying out a pet name, or he calls her my dear, and that's what Mr. Bennett always says to Mrs. Bennett when he's cross at her. He says Mrs. Bennett, so she doesn't want any of that. So she's running on the list of names he can call her, and then he says, "What should I call you when I'm cross, Mrs. Darcy?" And she says, "No, you may only call me Mrs. Darcy when you are perfectly and incandescently happy," which leads us to the final moments of the film, where it says, "Well, then, how are you this evening, Mrs. Darcy?" And they kiss. Mrs. Darcy. They kiss again. Mrs. Darcy. And we get that final, lingering kiss. It cuts to black, and we get in the musical score coming in, and just butterflies in my stomach. And it's just such a beautiful moment. And Aaron, no, you're wrong. It's not overly sappy. It's perfect, and that's the end of it.
I'm gonna second that. I respect the difference of opinion, of course, but and I believe you have the Jane Austen Society of North America on your side, but I'm going to disagree with them as well. I'm a sappy American. I want my sappy American ending, to the point where when I've watched this movie on the BBC channel and they cut off the end after the scene, I'm like, no, this won't do. I go grab my DVD, I put it in, I watch the final scene. But just, I find it lovely for, just to see that kind of easy intimacy that at this point they have now richly earned. That they're going to be happy together. The kiss at the end, like the BBC miniseries in 1995, the final shot of that one is Darcy and Elizabeth kissing in the carriage as they pull away from their wedding venue. I think it's only fitting that that this movie gets to end with a kiss as well. Every bit as romantic. So I'm on this particular issue, there may be some differences of opinion, but I will always stand by this final ending. And I will note that, at least according to some research I heard that there was a bit of a backlash in the UK when they removed this scene, and they ended up re-releasing the movie in theaters with this scene added, because
there you go.
Everyone should get to enjoy it.
Yeah, it's just finishing off. I just have to say, I cannot sing the praises of this movie enough. It has been one of my favorites ever since I saw it, although I'll admit that I was not brave or secure enough to actually admit to it for the first few months after I saw it. It took some courage to say, yeah, that's right, one of my favorite movies is Pride and Prejudice, because it's not a normal thing for it's not something that comes up in conversation amongst guys, even when talking about what our favorite cinema might be. But I've thankfully gotten to the point where I'm like, I don't care what anybody else says. It's one of my absolutely favorite movies, and what's great is it opened me up to so many new things. I started reading books and seeing films that I would never have watched otherwise. This led directly into, since it was shortly after this that they announced that Keira Knightley and Joe Wright were doing Atonement together. I sought out that book and read it, loved it, and then looked forward to the movie and loved that. It's also one of my favorite films. And, I just started reading Jane Austen books, and, and just in general, watching movies that I no longer really care about what genre a movie is. a great movie is a great movie, and I'm open to so much more than I might have been otherwise.
Yeah. No, I mean, this movie was a door opener for me as well. Just in terms of, I've always appreciated a good love story, and the tagline for this movie when they were selling this love story was, I believe, this holiday season experience the greatest love story ever told. And honestly, for me, there was no false advertising. This lives up to that billing. Obviously, we have Jane Austen to thank for that. She was a genius, well ahead of her time. But no matter like with this adaptation, with the BBC adaptation, like everything about this story just shines through because it is timeless, it is universal, and it speaks to fundamental human truths that anyone should be able to relate to, and I feel that there's no shame in it. So it's one of my favorite movies as well. I wouldn't know exactly where to rank it, but it's on the outskirts of my top 10, maybe even in my top 10. So I've seen it more times than I can count, and I will continue to do so. And it was a pleasure being able to revisit it with you, and to kind of take a deeper dive than I might otherwise, and just kind of drink in everything about this story that means a lot to me, and I'm happy to hear means a lot to others as well.
Yeah. And, as I mentioned before, this film sort of operates as the first in a trilogy of Keira Knightley and Joe Wright period pieces, which I do intend to spend some time on the other two as well. If you want, you can come back for one or both of those. Jared, I'll leave that up to you.
All right.
And but yeah, this movie changed so much for me. So I do consider it one of the most impactful movie going experiences I ever had, and I'm very thankful for it. And it did effectively make me a Keira Knightley fanboy, because I remember it was just a couple of years after this and Atonement when like The Duchess came out, and that's a movie that beforehand I probably wouldn't have been caught dead going to the movies to see, but I lined up for a ticket and I was like, yep, I'm here for the next Keira Knightley movie. And so
yeah, no, for me, like, Keira Knightley really exploded onto my radar with Pirates of the Caribbean. Obviously, I'd seen her before in The Phantom Menace, but I didn't really know it was her then. But it was kind of the double beat of Pirates of the Caribbean and Bend It Like Beckham that kind of put her on more. But it was this movie that really kind of cemented my appreciation for her, not only as an incredibly beautiful woman, but as a standing actress, like one of the very best of her time. And I love Atonement as well. I would be happy to talk about that one with you. Like I said, I do need to brush up on this because it's been a few years since I've seen it, but if you're back, I'll give that.
Yeah, I don't know if
I might have lost the video there.
Yeah, I was gonna say I wasn't sure if it's coming across on the stream, but you are cutting a little in and out for me. But you know what? Better at the end than than while we were in the middle of it. So yeah, I guess we can wrap it up unless anybody in the chat has any questions they want to ask us before we sign off. I'll just go through and talk real quick if there's some people who missed when I talked about it in the middle. Next week, I'll be back with Nessie talking about Rome Season 2. And then the week after that, I will be talking with Lauren, aka Shakespeare of Thrones, on Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet, which was done in 1996. I'm really looking forward to that. It's actually the first time I'll have had the opportunity to speak with Lauren one-on-one. We've talked on Twitter, but never face to face. So that'll be a lot of fun. And but yeah, if there's no questions, I guess we'll say goodbye. I want to thank you guys a lot for coming by. I think this was a great discussion. And yeah, thank you, Jared.
Oh, thank you, John. This was my first ever time doing something like this.
And you did an awesome job.
I appreciate that. But I had a great discussion partner and couldn't have asked for better subject matter. So it's only going to get harder from here, I'm sure. But I was happy to do it. I'm glad that we could share our love of this movie with your viewers of your channel, and I hope that we'll be able to do it again soon, and that everyone out there will, if you haven't seen Pride and Prejudice 2005 in a little while, maybe go back and watch it. It's pretty good.
Yes, please do. And spread this video around, because I'm sure it doesn't jump out as immediately must see viewing at first glance, but I'd really appreciate it if you guys would share it around. And if you think anybody would like to watch a discussion on Pride and Prejudice, go ahead and maybe tell them about this, and and then tell them that we do lots of other discussions on different films and TV shows. But I think that'll wrap it up. Thank you again, guys, for tuning in, and I will. And once again, before I go, just want to mention that also the trailer for season 2 of Rome is in the description. So if you want to take a look there for it, I'll be posting trailers in the description each week, just so you guys can get a glimpse of what we're talking about. And also you'll find Jared's Twitter handle in the description as well. Go follow him. He is a wonderfully positive voice on Twitter, probably the most positive voice, on my Twitter feed.
You're gonna have to put up with a lot of positive Star Wars takes if you follow me, as a fair warning, because I love that franchise, as my shirt attests. But I appreciate it. John, thank you so much for everything. And I hope to catch up with you on Twitter or on your channel at a point in the future. And thank you to everyone in the chat who has been so kind for my first go at this. So I can't thank you enough.
All right. Well, thank you, guys. I will see you next week. Have a great day. Bye.
Take care.